Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 856, and today is December 1st, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get into on today's show. Got to catch up from the Thanksgiving week. So I want to jump right into it. Just want to remind people to share all my work, which you can find on at Kyle Anzalone _ All right, starting off here today with an article I wrote for JudgeNap.com last week. Department of War opens investigation into Senator Mark Kelly over call for troops to disobey unlawful orders. And so I think what we have here is an effort to silence a sitting senator by the Department of War. They had this investigation. They say that because any member of the military can be called back into active duty, their conduct, their decorum, what they say, means that they could be investigated and then called for a court martial. Now, I would find this problematic if the Department of War was investigating any American military veteran who had retired, who had been making political statements, clearly engaging in free speech. But it seems particularly egregious to do this to a sitting senator. And look, I don't have really anything positive to say about Mark Kelly. I don't agree with essentially any of his policy positions, but one of the core principles of America is, I may not agree what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And here we have a pretty clear example of Kelly being attempted to be silenced by the Department of War. I don't expect this investigation to lead to anything, for Senator Kelly to be court-martialed, for this to be brought any more forward than it already has been. But, and look, I don't even think this is necessarily meant to be a message to Kelly, but other veterans who wouldn't have the same profile, resources, they're not a sitting senator, that Senator Kelly has. And so they may think twice before they tell somebody to not follow an unlawful order, because if they were investigated by the Pentagon, maybe they wouldn't have the same ability to stand up like Mark Kelly is, and they would actually become a target. And in the actual statement that the Pentagon said, it became pretty clear that this was the point. They even mentioned, like, hey, warning to other veterans, watch your conduct because we are keeping tabs on this. Now, this whole incident started when Senator Kelly and I believe 5 other Democratic lawmakers who were either former members of the CIA, intelligence community, or military issued a statement addressed to active duty troops, telling them that they don't have to follow unlawful orders. And then this weekend, this story came out in the Washington Post that Senator Pete Hegseth had given the order to kill everybody in a strike on a drug boat. And so this is, from the Washington Post, the Special Operations Command overseeing the September 2nd attack, the opening salvo in the Trump administration's war on suspected drug traffickers in the Western Hemisphere, ordered a second strike to comply with Hegseth's instructions. And so essentially what you have here is Pete Hegseth orders, the Secretary of War, orders an attack on a boat carrying 11 people, and that the military intelligence suspected was carrying drugs. So Pete Hegseth orders the strike, and his order is kill everybody. And so the strike occurs, and 9 of the 11 people are dead instantly, but 2 people, once the smoke clears, are seen clinging to the wreckage of the vessel. And I guess there was concern that they were going to be able to survive, although I kind of imagine that had they just let them sitting out there for a little bit, nature would have kind of run its course on these men. But rather than engaging in that tactic, what the Department of War does is they conduct a second strike on the survivors and blow them apart in the water. So this is straight up murder. Even if Congress had declared war. Even if the boat was carrying drugs and armed men who were coming to the United States to kill the two people who survived, who clearly, they don't have weapons, they don't have any more drugs. The boat is destroyed, so they have no means of transportation to the U.S. I'm not sure there's like a positive obligation to go and rescue them, but you certainly cannot execute them with a second strike once their ship, like, if this happened in Iraq in some way where we suspected there was a group of militants, we conduct a strike, and then there's two survivors laying on the ground, no arms in sight or anything, like, to carry out a second strike would be murder in that case. So this is abundantly clear that this is a murder that happened here. And I do wonder if the Democrat senators had some previous knowledge that either this order was given or that the Washington Post was coming out with this story, and that's why they made their video, because here you clearly have an unlawful order, Pete Hegseth giving the order to kill everybody. Now, I do wonder if this is more incompetence than malice on behalf of the Secretary of War, where this man truly is not qualified for the role that he is in. And so he might not have realized when he gave the order to kill everybody that would be interpreted down the line, command chain, as if there are survivors, you kill them. And one of the reasons I say this is there have been, I think, at least 2 other incidents, because they've destroyed 20 more boats since this first one, where there was a survivor, and those survivors were not executed with the second strike, but they were arrested. So, again, I'm not 100% sure as to if there was a change in policy, if maybe Pete Hegseth didn't intend for his order to be interpreted that way. Although, you are the Secretary of Defense, you did give the order, so I'm not trying to take away his responsibility here. And, this is a matter for a court to decide, of course, but it does seem reasonable, and if we lived in a just society, to bring Pete Hegseth on for the charge of murder here. Again, I don't think it's going to happen, and the court would ultimately be the one to decide the legality, but by saying that his order may have not been interpreted in the way he meant was not in a way to excuse what he did or to suggest that he still isn't guilty of crimes. Okay, moving on here. I have one more story about Venezuela. So this one from Dave DeCamp, November 29th, antiwar.com. Trump declares closure of Venezuela's airspace. And so I'm going to read Trump's Truth Social post here. To all airlines, pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers, please consider the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela to be closed in its entirety. And so multiple things here. I'll just start off by saying it's absurd that we all have to go to Trump's Truth Social account where you're flooded with the most ridiculous ads that you have ever seen. I'm sure netting the president and his family quite a good chunk of money from all the ad revenue of us having to go to his Truth Social page to figure out what's happening in foreign policy. That foreign policy is announced on Truth Social is simply absurd. The order itself is simply absurd. My understanding is the Bolivar Airport in Caracas is functioning as normal. And so Trump really doesn't have the ability to just close Venezuela's airspace. Now, the bigger picture here, of course, is what does this mean? And there's been really 2 lines of speculation heavily coming out here. The first is that an American attack is imminent, and I am concerned that this is the case. I'm not convinced, but I am concerned that that's what's going to happen. The second is that the U.S. has arranged for some kind of deal for Maduro to flee the country, and so they want to close the airspace to get first Maduro out, and then whoever they're bringing in, I guess that would be Maria Machada into the country. So that scenario seems significantly less likely to me, that Maduro is on the cusp of giving up his control and leaving the country. Now, if either of those scenarios are true, it is very problematic, I think, for Americans. Venezuela currently not a major traffic hub of drug trafficking, particularly into the United States. If Maduro leaves and they try to put somebody else in control, or if they go to war in Venezuela, that will weaken the Venezuelan government. And certainly there's significant cartel activity in multiple of the surrounding countries: Ecuador, Colombia, Peru. And so you would assume that those drug traffickers, who don't necessarily have national loyalties, that's not what they're concerned about. They just want to make money. They just want to be able to smuggle their drugs for the cheapest price point possible, expand their drug territory, would likely see Venezuela as an opportunity. Additionally, the instability, even if this went well, the instability would likely create pretty massive economic troubles for the Venezuelan people, who already live in pretty extreme poverty. A lot of the poor people in Venezuela are very supportive of Maduro, and so if he leaves power, they may not see a future for themselves in Venezuela, and with economic hardship, they will set out north and try to come to the United States. And so this will create a migration crisis as well. Now, I wonder about the possibility that this is just another effort in the Trump administration's psyop against Maduro and the Venezuelan government, that basically they're trying to scare Maduro into leaving, and they think that if they say this, Maduro will believe that a war is imminent, and that he will choose to leave power rather than fight a war with the Americans. I'm not sure that's even what Maduro would do if he did choose to go down that path, but very interesting. All right, next up here. This one I wrote for the Institute on November 30th. Zelensky's chief of staff resigns after police raid his home in anti-corruption probe. And so last week on the show, we discussed that there was a anti-corruption investigation in Ukraine that has led to charges against a former business partner of Zelensky, as well as the energy and justice ministers who both resigned. This scheme involved the nuclear energy facilities of Ukraine, and there was at least $100 million stolen. So now Andrei Yermak, the chief of staff of Ukrainian President Zelensky, resigned after police raided his home. And so he confirmed the raid on X. Zelensky then issued a statement praising Yermak and announcing that he had resigned. So the reason that this is important, well, there's two reasons this is important. Yermak was apparently a very powerful figure behind the scenes in Ukraine. There's Ukrainian officials comparing this to a political earthquake, and a lot of people saying that essentially they don't know what's going to happen next, that this could be a major political upheaval in Ukraine. Of course, it's worth mentioning here that over the summer, the Zelensky tried to strip power from the Ukrainian anti-corruption bureaus, the NABU and the SAP, after he actually passed a law limiting their power. The people took to the streets, largest protests against the Ukrainian government since the start of the war, and Zelensky ultimately had to walk back those reforms to the anti-corruption bureaus, and these are the bureaus that have arrested Yermak. And one has to wonder, had those anti-corruption bureaus been reformed as Zelensky wanted, if these charges would be moving forward. The second major thing here is that Yermak had been leading the negotiations with the Americans on the upcoming peace deal. He was actually supposed to be in Miami either last night or today for talks with Rubio, Witkoff, Kushner, so the leading people in Trump's foreign policy team. Obviously, he didn't attend those talks and was replaced. So this could be a little bit of a hiccup in the Ukrainian negotiating side as well. One Ukrainian official did say that they believe this weakened Ukraine's negotiating position overall with the Russians. It's easy to see how that would be the case, as even if this doesn't necessarily change anything when it comes to the war, it's hard to imagine that this corruption scandal, especially as it gets bigger and involves more people close to Zelensky, isn't going to be viewed by the Europeans as problematic and a sign that they're giving the Ukrainians too much aid and it's not being used well. All right, next up here, moving on to Gaza. I wrote this one on November 25th for the Institute. UN, over 70% of buildings damaged or destroyed. Rebuilding will cost more than $70 billion. And so this is from a assessment by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. And what they concluded was that 70% of all buildings total in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. So this is hospitals, schools, homes, stores, bakeries, shop, anything that you could imagine. 70% of those have been damaged or destroyed. There has been a particular emphasis by Israel on essential buildings, mosques. UNICEF says that 90% of school buildings have been destroyed. Many of those school buildings were being used for shelters, actually, to house people, right? Like if you have a building that's got 20 classrooms in it, you easily get 20 families in there, or maybe not easily, but you could. And so that's a way to help people. I think like 80% of homes have been damaged or destroyed. Almost all hospitals damaged or destroyed. And so this is, just goes to show the level of destruction. The UNCTAD also looked at the economic damage that this has done to Gaza. They said that GDP in Gaza had been reduced to $161 per capita, is now one of the lowest in the world, and just 5% of what the Palestinians have in the West Bank. And the Palestinians in the West Bank had also had an economic war leveled against them, and their GDP has been reduced by about 20% as well. And they also note here that the rebuilding will take decades to rebuild Gaza to get the Palestinians back to their standard of living on October 7th, 2023, which was, of course, already deplorable and problematic, but just even to get back to that problematic stage is going to take decades and $70 billion. And, of course, that's if anybody ever allows Gaza to be rebuilt. Next up here, Israeli official says no progress in establishing international security force for Gaza. I just want to take a moment to update here, right, that we had this ceasefire that went into effect in Gaza on October 10th. Now, over 350 Palestinians have been killed since October 10th. That's probably 7.5 weeks now. So, of course, there's not a real ceasefire in Gaza. Israel's killing Palestinians every day, scores of children, hundreds of civilians, maybe some militants in there as well. But even under a ceasefire, they really shouldn't be killing the militants. That's what a ceasefire is. That's what a ceasefire means, right? If Russia and Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire, and then Russia kept bombing Ukraine every day, mostly killing civilians, but killing a handful of neo-Nazis as well. And Russia was saying, we're abiding by the ceasefire. We're just killing the neo-Nazis. Everybody would say, neo-Nazis are bad, but a ceasefire means that you cease firing, right? That means you have agreed to end the hostilities. And so you can't agree to a ceasefire and then continue to bomb the party that you're in a ceasefire with or you're no longer in a ceasefire. So there is no ceasefire in Gaza, right? The level of violence has been reduced. A little bit more aid has gotten in, but that's it. There hasn't been a real ceasefire. Now, Hamas agreed to release the 20 living Israeli hostages and then return the bodies of the 28 deceased captives. At this point, Hamas has now returned 27 of the 28 bodies and released all the living captives, which is honestly astounding to me that they've been able to turn over this many bodies this quickly. Somebody said it's been 7 weeks. These bodies are buried under the rubble, and for the first month, Israel refused to allow Egyptian teams in with demolition or debris clearing equipment to actually go in, dig out the tunnels, and recover the bodies. So that it's been done this quickly has been a surprise to me. That Hamas is able to locate this many bodies is a surprise to me. There are some speculation at the front, even American officials saying that Hamas was only sure of the location of like 13 to 15 bodies, which meant that potentially half the bodies would never be found, never be returned. A lot of these people have been dead since October 7, 2023, or in the months after. And so, you know, these are decomposed bodies that likely didn't get quality embalming, if not any at all. And so that there could be significant decay. It's hard to tell maybe the Israelis from the Palestinian dead, things like that. So that they've been able to turn over all these bodies is quite impressive. Now, once Hamas returns the last body, the agreement is supposed to move into phase 2, which would see a further Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and a whole bunch of other steps taken. The problem is that when the initial hostage exchange and ceasefire was agreed to, and American officials have admitted this. I read this on Fox News, right? Like, this is U.S. officials speaking to Fox News, so it's official U.S. government line. And what they said was that the U.S. rushed the ceasefire and hostage exchange, left major issues on the table to be resolved in phase 2. The problem is there's been no progress in resolving those issues. And so the two major ones would be, is Hamas going to be disarmed, or will the Palestinians in Gaza be disarmed, not just Hamas? And exactly what that looks like, right? Like, if Hamas agrees to, say, only have small arms, in a lot of ways that is disarmed, right? Like, if you're just a bunch of guys with AK-47s, then you've really significantly diminished your military capability. But Israel is, of course, saying no guns whatsoever in Gaza. I'm not sure if they're going to go as far as the Brits and start taking knives away from people, but certainly no guns allowed in Gaza is the goal here of the Israelis. And if that is the condition, I think not just Hamas, but Palestinians in Gaza will be very reluctant to accept that. The second piece is the International Stabilization Force, the ISF. And the only country that wants to send their troops to participate in the ISF is Turkey and Qatar, and the countries that Israel explicitly says can't be a part of the ISF are Turkey and Qatar. And so it seems like the Israelis, Tel Aviv, are just essentially doing everything they can at this point to make sure that this ceasefire doesn't move forward. All right, next up here, study. Israeli forces likely killed more than 100,000 Palestinians in Gaza. And so this was a study done by the German-based Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. And it calculated deaths just from October 7th, 2023 to December 31st, 2024. And so from that period, the expected death toll was about 80,000. And they now say that the number is likely over 100,000. My guess is that even this estimate is a pretty significant undercount, but worth noting here when a German European Institute is putting out these kinds of numbers. Next up, UN committee warns torturing Palestinians is Israeli state policy. So, a UN committee on torture concluded that torturing Palestinians in Israeli detention was de facto U.S. policy, de facto Israeli policy, and they kind of just looked into all the reports, evidence from survivors, and said that this is clearly going on. Israel has rounded up tens of thousands of Palestinians since October 7, 2023. 75% of them are innocent civilians. They only identified 25% as militants, and yet they're all being subject to this extreme torture. We've recently gotten reports from journalists, doctors who are held inside of Israeli prisons, saying that they are being not only tortured, but deprived of medical care, food, and other things. And of course, this isn't a surprise in any sense of the word. Israel has tortured Palestinians for decades. Some of the torture practices that were employed by Americans in Gitmo and Abu Ghraib were torture methods designed by the Israelis to use on the Palestinians. But on top of that, the national security minister who runs Israel's prisons, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has bragged about how he made the conditions in Israeli prisons even worse. All right, shifting over to the West Bank real quick. Israel launches major military operation targeting Palestinians in towns in northern West Bank. And Israel has been conducting raids in the West Bank pretty frequently since October 7th, 2023. This is the first named major military offensive that the IDF has conducted in the West Bank. And one of the reasons this story was interesting is that this was all from Ynet. This is what a senior Israeli official explained. Since the war, they understand that Israel and the IDF have changed, both in posture and mindset. In the past, if an intelligence identified a target for elimination, we hesitate, calculating the potential fallout and weighing how many senior approval or troops it will require. Today is different, smoother, faster, easier. And so what they're talking about is they're just going out, killing people in the West Bank, conducting raids in the West Bank. There's not a lot of oversight. A second official explained, today our forces can reach every centimeter of the West Bank. That has not happened since 1967. And then one of the very interesting things that they admit in this article is that the reason they had been concerned in the past about cracking down too hard in the West Bank was it's going to invite people to stand up to that oppression and retaliate. And they say that they've been able to prevent this by basically being communist, right? Where if you have propaganda material, they throw you in the gulag just like Stalin's thugs would, or Mao's guys would. They just arrest anyone who has any sense of dissent. They're constantly going into these villages, raiding, abusing the Palestinians, dehumanizing them. And so, at least from the Israeli perspective, it seems that they believe they've broken the will of the Palestinians in the West Bank with their massive crackdown. Last up here today, Netanyahu submits pardon request. And so Netanyahu has officially sent a letter to the Israeli president, who doesn't have much power. Effectively, Netanyahu is the president of Israel to compare it to American terms. But where the actual president of Israel, Herzog, does have a lot of power, is in the power to grant a pardon. Now, from my understanding of what I read from Israeli legal analysts, what Netanyahu is asking for here isn't really possible. You can't get pardoned in the middle of your trial. If you are tried and convicted, you could then receive a pardon, but you can't just get pardoned like in the way that Joe Biden pardoned Hunter Biden, like preemptively, right? You have to either have a conviction or maybe the trial wasn't going on. Herzog's office called the pardon request an extraordinary request, and they said they're going to look at it carefully. The Jerusalem Post said they believe it's going to take up to 2 months for Herzog to make a determination. And Netanyahu is saying that he needs the pardon because the court's asking him to testify 3 days a week, and he simply can't do that. Netanyahu is facing 4 different corruption charges, and while by American standards he didn't steal that much money, I think it's possible that he could be convicted here, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens if a sitting Israeli prime minister is convicted of corruption and, say, sentenced to prison or something like that. Would he resign? Would he try to use the office to stay out of jail and cling to power? We will see. Now, Netanyahu also referenced that Trump wants him to get a pardon, and this is interesting that Netanyahu would bring this up. I actually think it's probably makes it less likely that Netanyahu will get a pardon in some respect, that you're invoking a foreign power as your need for a pardon. That being said, I'm guessing it's understood, at least among the Israeli political elite, that making sure the Americans are happy keeps the massive gravy train flowing, and maybe they'll do it for that reason. I think part of the reason Trump wants Netanyahu to get pardoned is he is at least under the belief, whether it's true or not, that part of the reason why Israel is conducting all these wars across the Middle East is because Netanyahu's ongoing corruption trials, and so maybe he thinks if the pardons come, then Netanyahu will be willing to settle for peace. I'm not sure that's correct analysis, but at the very least, it's maybe interesting that Trump would understand things that way. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Remember to check out the Kyle Anzalone Show. You can find a top link in the show notes page. Today at 4:45 Eastern, the great Harrison Berger returns to the show. He got access to the Epstein emails, at least some of them, and I want to ask him about what he found. Thanks, everyone.